The day began with a peculiar kind of brightness, the sort of golden sunlight that makes everything look sharper, almost as though reality itself has been polished for some special occasion. The town square was bustling, filled with the chatter of neighbors who all seemed to know one another's business, as was the custom in such a close-knit community. Children darted between the legs of grown-ups, their hands sticky from stolen bites of toffee from Mrs. Calloway's sweet stall, while the elderly gathered on benches to watch the commotion with knowing smiles. Merchants had set up their carts, in neat rows along the cobbled edges, their colorful awnings flapping gently in the warm breeze. Every scent seemed amplified, the yeasty aroma of fresh bread cooling on wooden trays, the faint tang of horses tethered nearby, the sweet perfume of early spring flowers spilling from baskets. In the midst of all this activity, a small wooden platform had been erected for the day's official ceremonies. It was nothing grand, just a raised stage draped with the town's faded green and gold banner, but it was enough to command attention. There were chairs set up for a handful of town officials, each of whom wore the same expression of mild self-importance, as if they were about to preside over matters that could shape history. In reality, the day's agenda was much more mundane. The signing of a few property deeds, the renewal of trade licenses, and some minor declarations about upcoming events. But here, in a place where life was usually predictable and slow, even such routine formalities drew an eager crowd. Among the onlookers was Thomas Avery, a man who, by all accounts, had mastered the art of blending in. He was neither especially tall nor remarkably short, his build unremarkable, his face the sort that could be forgotten moments after meeting him. His profession suited his temperament. He worked as a junior clerk at the town's post office, a job that required neat handwriting, patience, and an endless tolerance for paperwork. On most days, Thomas moved quietly through the rhythm of sorting letters, stamping envelopes, and filing forms without ever becoming the focus of anyone's gaze. If the world were a play, Thomas would be the man moving scenery in the background, not the actor delivering the lines. But on this particular morning, he had been given a small errand by his employer, Mr. Greaves, the postmaster. "Take these forms down to the square," Mr. Greaves had said, waving a stack of documents in Thomas's direction. "They need to be signed and filed by the registrar before the week is out. Shouldn't take you more than an hour, and for heaven's sake, don't lose them." Thomas had nodded, as he always did, slipping the papers into his worn leather satchel alongside his lunch, a modest cheese sandwich wrapped in wax paper. It was a simple task, one he'd performed dozens of times before. Nothing about it hinted at the chaos it would unleash. The walk to the square took Thomas past familiar landmarks, the old stone church with its leaning steeple, the narrow alley behind the bakery where warm air and the smell of cinnamon rolls escaped from open windows, and the small bridge that crossed the sluggish stream winding its way out of town. Along the way, he exchanged polite nods with acquaintances, Mrs. Penfold, who sold flowers, Mr. Hargreaves, who sharpened knives, young Samuel Pritchard, who always seemed to be chasing his runaway goat. Each greeting was brief, a passing ripple on the calm surface of his day. When Thomas arrived at the square, the ceremonies were already underway. A stout man in a wide-brimmed hat was reading names from a ledger, summoning townsfolk to the platform, one by one. Beside him stood the registrar, a thin, hurried-looking fellow with spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose, ink stains on his cuffs, and an expression suggesting he was already behind schedule. People shuffled forward, signed whatever needed signing, and stepped down to polite applause or occasional laughter. Thomas edged his way closer to the platform, trying not to draw attention. He wasn't fond of crowds, and he certainly had no interest in lingering longer than necessary. His plan was simple: wait for a lull, approach the registrar, hand over his forms, sign wherever he was told, and be gone in time to eat his sandwich in peace by the stream. But plans, as Thomas was about to learn, have a habit of unraveling in the most unexpected ways. Just as he reached the front of the crowd, the stout man in the hat spotted him. "Ah, there you are," the man bellowed, waving Thomas forward with a flourish as though they were old friends. Thomas hesitated, glancing behind him to see if perhaps the greeting was meant for someone else. But no, the man's gaze was fixed squarely on him, his hand still beckoning. Thomas stepped onto the platform, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. The registrar, without so much as a word of explanation, thrust a thick sheaf of papers toward him. "Sign here," he said briskly, tapping the bottom of the page with an ink-stained finger. Thomas glanced at the forms only briefly. The text was cramped and formal, the kind of dense legal language that always made his eyes glaze over. The official's impatient sigh didn't help, not wanting to hold up the proceedings. And assuming this was just another tedious formality for the post office, Thomas dipped the quill into the inkwell, steadied his hand, and scrawled his name in neat cursive. The registrar whisked the papers away before the ink had even dried, and the stout man clapped Thomas on the back with such enthusiasm that he nearly stumbled forward. What happened next felt like stepping into a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. From the far side of the square, a cheer erupted. Heads turned. People began to murmur, then laugh. The crowd shifted, making way for someone approaching with long, confident strides. Thomas squinted against the sun, trying to make out the figure, and then his mouth fell open. A woman, no, a towering woman, was walking straight toward him. She moved with the kind of presence that made it impossible to look away, her shadow stretching far across the sunlit cobblestones. Her hair was bound in thick braids that swung like ropes behind her, and her broad shoulders and strong frame made her seem almost larger than life. Her eyes, sharp and bright, locked on Thomas with an expression that was both triumphant and amused. Before he could ask a single question, the stout man's voice boomed over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to present our newest couple, husband and wife." The square erupted into applause, whistles, and good-natured laughter. Thomas froze, his mind scrambling to process the words. Husband and wife. That couldn't be right. He'd come here to submit paperwork for the post office, not whatever this was. But somewhere, deep down, a small, sinking feeling told him that he had just made a very, very big mistake. For a long, bewildering moment, Thomas simply stood there, rooted to the wooden planks of the platform, as the sound of cheering swelled around him like a rising tide. It was as though the world had tilted on its axis, leaving him struggling to find his footing in a reality that no longer made sense. A moment ago, he had been a quiet clerk delivering mundane paperwork. Now, without warning or consent, he was apparently a married man, and not to just any woman, but to one who seemed to tower over nearly everyone else in the square. The giant woman, or at least that's how his mind stubbornly labeled her, though giant wasn't entirely fair, stood beside him now. Up close, she seemed even taller, her head easily half a foot above his own, her frame broad but not ungraceful. She was dressed in clothes that looked partly ceremonial, partly practical, a deep blue tunic that caught the sunlight, stitched with gold thread and patterns that reminded him of mountain ridges and rivers. Over her shoulders was a thick woolen shawl, the kind worn by shepherds in the high pastures, and on her feet were sturdy leather boots that looked as though they had crossed more than a few miles of rough country. Her presence radiated a quiet authority, the kind that made people straighten their backs without realizing it. Thomas had never seen her before in his life. Of that, he was absolutely certain. She wasn't someone from the post office queue, nor from the weekly market. She wasn't a name he could recall from town gossip or from the church's list of families. Yet, as she turned her gaze on him, fully, there was something unsettling in the way her eyes, a startling, pale gray, searched his face. It was the look of someone who had been expecting him. "Thomas Avery," the stout man in the hat announced again, his voice booming, as though repetition might hammer the truth deeper into reality. "By the authority vested in me, by the registrar's office and the customs of our fine town, you are now lawfully wed to Miss Branneth Orstatter." The crowd erupted into fresh laughter and applause, though there were also a few gasps. Thomas caught sight of Mrs. Penfold, the flower seller, clutching her shawl in mock astonishment. Samuel Pritchard's goat bleated as if it, too, objected to this union. Somewhere in the throng, a fiddler had struck up a jaunty tune, and two children began spinning each other in circles as though this were a festival rather than a legal ceremony gone horribly wrong. "Wait," Thomas managed to say, though his voice was swallowed by the noise. He turned toward the registrar, who was already busy with the next set of papers, his head bent low over the ledger. "There's been a mistake," but before he could finish, Branneth Orsidodia's hand came to rest on his shoulder. It wasn't a rough grip, but it carried weight, literal and metaphorical. Her palm was warm, her fingers long and strong, calloused like someone used to real work. The touch was enough to make him stop mid-sentence. "Best to smile," she murmured, her voice low and even, with the faintest accent he couldn't quite place. For now, Thomas looked up at her, baffled. "Smile," he repeated, but her expression gave nothing away. The stout man seized Thomas's other hand and lifted it high into the air, as though presenting a prize, a perfect match. He declared, "Our newest couple, united under the eyes of the town, the registrar," and he gestured broadly toward the heavens, "whatever higher powers may be watching." Thomas's mind spun in circles, trying to piece together how such an absurd thing could have happened. He replayed the morning in his head, walking to the square, approaching the platform, the registrar handing him the papers. Could those forms possibly have been a marriage contract? And if so, why had they been thrust at him without explanation? More importantly, how had his name been paired with hers? He was pulled from his thoughts when Branna gave a small nod toward the edge of the platform. "Shall we?" she asked, as though they were partners who had been planning this moment all along. Her tone was calm, but her eyes, sharp as ice against sunlight, suggested that she was measuring him, weighing him, deciding something important in that instant. Thomas wanted to protest, to insist on a correction before the situation spiraled further out of control. But as he glanced out at the sea of faces, friends, acquaintances, strangers, he felt the walls closing in. Every pair of eyes seemed fixed on him, waiting to see what he would do. There was an odd social pressure in that moment, as though the weight of tradition and spectacle could crush any resistance. So, Against his better judgment, he let her lead him down the short steps from the platform. The crowd parted with curious smiles and muttered congratulations. Someone thrust a small bouquet of wildflowers into Brana's hand. Someone else slapped Thomas on the back so hard his teeth clicked together. And through it all, he felt as if he were moving in a haze, the sounds too loud, the colors too bright, the sensation of unreality clinging to everything. As they walked, he risked another glance at her. Brana didn't seem flustered at all. If anything, she walked with a sense of purpose, her long strides eating up the cobblestones as though she had somewhere very specific in mind. Her grip on his arm was steady, guiding him more than pulling. "Miss Thorstadter," he began, but she interrupted him without looking over. "Brana," she corrected. "Brana," he said, trying the name out. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," she said quietly, though the firmness in her voice made it clear the conversation was not open for debate. That sent a fresh chill down his spine. If she believed this was intentional, then what did that mean for him? And if she wasn't surprised by this sudden marriage, then who else had known? As they reached the edge of the square, the fiddler's tune faded behind them, replaced by the quieter sounds of daily life, a cart creaking under the weight of sacks of grain, a baker calling out his prices, the distant chatter of women, hanging laundry between houses. The further they went, the more Thomas's mind whirled with questions he couldn't voice. He had set out that morning with nothing more pressing than the safe delivery of some paperwork. Now, in the span of less than an hour, he was walking beside a stranger who the entire town believed to be his wife, and she didn't seem inclined to correct them. And somewhere, buried beneath the shock and confusion, a small, unnerving thought began to take root. What if she had planned it that way all along? They moved away from the square, Brana leading with an unhurried confidence that contrasted sharply with the frantic storm of thoughts spinning in Thomas's head. The cobblestones beneath their feet were uneven, worn down by decades of passing boots and hooves, and the air smelled faintly of fresh bread from the baker's shop, mixed with the sharper temps of drying fish from the wharf 2 streets away. Thomas barely noticed any of it. His mind was consumed with the absurdity of what had just happened. He kept trying to form a plan, some coherent sequence of steps that might reverse this mess. First, he would go back to the registrar and demand an explanation. No, first, he'd have to separate himself from Brana, because every passing moment they walked side by side cemented the image of them as a couple in the eyes of the townsfolk. But even as he thought it, he realized how difficult that might be. Brana's hand still rested lightly on his arm, and while her grip wasn't forceful, there was something about her presence that made pulling away feel impractical. Not dangerous, exactly, but ill-advised. They turned down a narrower street where the midday light fell in long, golden slants between the close-set buildings. Laundry fluttered overhead on ropes strung from window to window, casting shifting patches of shade over the ground. An elderly man leaning on a cane nodded at them with a smile, clearly assuming this was a newlywed couple taking their first walk together. Thomas gave an awkward half-smile in return, while Brana inclined her head as if to accept the man's good wishes. He tried again. "Look, Brana, I'm not sure what just happened back there, but it's a mistake. I wasn't supposed to." She cut him off with a small glance, one that was neither angry nor amused, but somehow conveyed that she'd already anticipated every word he might say. "It's done," she said simply, as though that were the end of it. That phrase, "it's done," rattled in his skull. Done. Did she mean the ceremony couldn't be undone? That no one would believe his protests? Or was she simply stating the obvious that, as far as the crowd was concerned, they were now man and wife? They walked on in silence for a while. The street curved gently, leading them toward the outskirts of town where the houses grew farther apart and small gardens appeared between them. Thomas noticed that Brana's stride didn't falter once. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. It occurred to him that perhaps she wasn't just walking aimlessly, perhaps she was taking him somewhere specific. Finally, unable to contain himself, he blurted out, "Were you expecting this?" Her lips curved, not into a smile, exactly, but into something close. "I was expecting you," she said, without elaboration. That answer sent another ripple of unease through him. He couldn't recall ever meeting her before, yet her certainty made it seem as though she had been waiting for this moment for some time. They passed a small well where 2 women were filling buckets. Both women paused, mid-task, to watch them, their eyes darting between Thomas and Brana with barely concealed curiosity. One of them whispered something to the other, and they both laughed softly. Thomas felt heat rising to his cheeks. This was exactly the kind of small-town rumor mill fuel he had wanted to avoid, and now he was at the center of it. "Brana, I need to talk to the registrar," he said firmly. "We can sort this out if we explain the mistake." "No," she said, in that same calm, unyielding tone. "The registrar won't undo it. He had the list." "The list," Thomas repeated. She didn't answer right away. Instead, they rounded another corner, and Thomas found himself staring at the looming shape of an old stone building, its walls covered in ivy, its roofline jagged where slates had slipped. A heavy wooden door stood at the top of a short flight of steps, and without hesitation, Brana began to climb them. Thomas hung back. "What is this place?" "My home," she said over her shoulder. That one word, home, landed heavily. Was she expecting him to go inside? To live here? The thought made his stomach twist. He'd walked into the square this morning, a free man with an uneventful day ahead. Now he was standing at the threshold of a stranger's home, apparently bound to her by law and public declaration. But before he could voice his refusal, the door swung open from within. A tall, broad-shouldered man, not quite as tall as Brana, but close, stood there. His hair was the same pale blonde as hers, his jaw square, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Thomas thought the man might be her brother. "You brought him," the man said to Brana, as though this had been an expected delivery rather than a chance encounter. Brana nodded once. "Thomas Avery," she said, gesturing to him. "My husband." Thomas opened his mouth to protest again. But something about the way the man's eyes swept over him, assessing, appraising, made him shut it just as quickly. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and herbs. The room was large, with a high-beamed ceiling and a massive stone hearth along one wall. Bundles of dried flowers and plants hung from the rafters, and on the far side, a heavy oak table was set with bread, cheese, and 2 mugs of something dark and steaming. The man stepped aside, making room for Thomas to enter. "You'd better come in," he said, against every scrap of logic and self-preservation screaming at him to leave. Thomas found himself crossing the threshold. The door closed behind him with a deep, final-sounding thud. And in that moment, with the scent of wood smoke curling in his nostrils and Brana standing at his side like a sentinel, it struck him that this accidental marriage might not have been an accident at all. The door's thud echoed longer than Thomas thought possible, as though the house itself had inhaled and closed itself off from the outside world. He stood just inside the threshold, his boots planted on wide planks worn smooth by years of footsteps. The faint creak beneath his heels felt like the groan of an old ship at sea. Brana moved past him without a word, her long stride carrying her toward the hearth where the fire crackled low, sending thin spirals of smoke up the chimney. She didn't glance back to see if he followed. She simply assumed he would, and, to Thomas's own irritation, he did. The broad-shouldered man shut the door with a deliberate slowness, the latch sliding into place with a metallic click that sounded uncomfortably final. "I'll fetch the others," the man said, and without waiting for a reply, he vanished through a side door. Thomas turned toward Brana, but before he could speak, she gestured toward the heavy oak table, said it wasn't a request. He hesitated. The chairs were carved from dark wood, their backs tall and rigid, the kind of furniture that felt as though it was meant to keep you in place rather than make you comfortable. Still, he pulled one out and lowered himself onto it. The wood was cold under his palms. Brana took the seat across from him, her long arms resting on the table. In the flickering light from the fire, the planes of her face were both softened and sharpened, her high cheekbones catching the glow, her eyes glimmering with something unreadable. She was studying him, not with open hostility, but with the patient scrutiny of someone weighing the worth of a thing they'd just acquired. He cleared his throat. "Brana, I think we need to clear something up. Back at the square, I didn't know what I was signing. I thought you were signing for something else." She interrupted smoothly. "A permit, a petition, some harmless paper that wouldn't bind you to anything." He blinked. "Yes, exactly." Her lips curved faintly. "And yet, here you are." The door to the side room opened again, and this time, 3 figures entered. All were tall, not quite as towering as Brana, but taller than Thomas by a head. 2 were women with the same pale hair and broad shoulders, their eyes cool and assessing. The third was a man with hair so fair it was almost white, his gaze sharp as a hawk's. They didn't introduce themselves. They simply took seats along the wall, their postures straight, their hands resting loosely on their knees. Thomas's skin prickled. This was no casual family gathering. This felt official. Brana poured something dark from a clay jug into one of the mugs on the table and slid it toward him. The liquid steamed faintly, carrying a bitter, earthy aroma he didn't recognize. "What is this?" he asked, not touching it. "A welcome drink," she said. His instincts screamed against it, but the room's collective gaze pinned him in. Placed to refuse outright would feel like stepping into open hostility. He lifted the mug, sniffed it again, and took a small sip. The taste was strange, woody, almost metallic, with a faint heat that spread down his throat. Brana watched him closely, as if waiting for the moment the drink might take hold of him. But nothing happened, at least not immediately. He set the mug down carefully. "Brana, I don't belong here. I need to go back to town, and you do belong here," she said, her tone quiet but absolute. The papers were signed in the square, in front of witnesses. "You stood at my side, accepted the band, and spoke the words. I didn't know what they meant." The pale-haired man spoke for the first time, his voice low and even. "It doesn't matter. You spoke them. The bond is sealed." Thomas's pulse quickened. "Bond? You mean marriage?" The man tilted his head. "Marriage is only the surface of it. The words settled over Thomas like a damp, suffocating cloth. The surface of it suggested there was more beneath, and whatever it was, he was certain he didn't want to know. Branna rose from her chair, her height casting a long shadow across the table. "You will stay here tonight," she said. "Tomorrow, you'll see why you were chosen." "Chosen? I wasn't." "You were," she said, cutting him off again. "Not by chance. Not by mistake." The others rose too, moving with the kind of silent coordination that made Thomas feel out of place in his own skin. The pale-haired man retrieved the jug and the mugs. The two women crossed to the hearth, and Branna moved to a small chest in the corner. She lifted the lid and took out something Thomas couldn't quite see, a folded length of fabric, deep red and embroidered with symbols that seemed to shift in the firelight. She laid it on the table between them. "You'll wear this tomorrow." Thomas stared at it, the weight of his situation pressing heavier with each passing second. He wanted to stand, to demand his release from whatever strange grip this towering woman and her kin had on him. But the truth was dawning in cold, relentless clarity the moment he had signed that paper, the moment he had stepped across their threshold. Something had closed around him, and he didn't know if there was a way out. The red garment lay between them on the table like a living thing, its deep, wind-dark folds catching and swallowing the firelight. Thomas's gaze kept returning to it despite himself, as if the fabric had its own gravity. The embroidery, intricate threads of gold and black, twisted into shapes that refused to settle into anything recognizable. Every time he thought he saw a pattern, a branch, a wave, a bird, it would shift, rearranging itself like smoke on water. He tore his eyes away, forcing them onto Branna instead. She stood perfectly still, watching him with that steady, unblinking gaze. In the flicker of the flames, the planes of her face seemed cut from stone. She didn't need to say a word. The silence between them was already speaking volumes, and none of it boded well for him. Thomas swallowed hard. "I'm not wearing that." Her lips curved faintly, though the expression never reached her eyes. "Yes, you will." "No," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He tried again, stronger this time. "No, I won't. I'm leaving in the morning, and I'm taking the road back to town. I don't know what you think happened in that square, but you think this is about you deciding." Her tone didn't rise, but it deepened, thickened, like a gathering storm. "You signed. You spoke the words. You were marked." Thomas's skin prickled. "Marked? What are you talking about?" The pale-haired man, who had been silent since retrieving the mugs, now stepped forward from the wall. He stopped beside Branna, his pale eyes boring into Thomas. "Lift your sleeve," he said. Thomas shook his head. "Why, lift it," the man repeated, this time not as a request. Against his better judgment, perhaps just to prove there was nothing there. Thomas shoved his right sleeve up to the elbow. At first, he saw nothing unusual. But then, as the firelight shifted, faint lines began to emerge on his skin, as though something had been drawn there in pale ink. It was a symbol. No, not a single symbol, a whole knotwork of lines, curling, and looping in on themselves, impossible to trace to a starting point. The mark shimmered faintly, and when he flexed his arm, it seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. His breath caught. "What the hell is that?" Branna reached out, and before he could flinch away, her fingers brushed the mark. A warmth spread instantly from the point of contact, rushing up his arm and into his chest. It was not a heat like fire, but something heavier, like the feeling of sinking into deep water. "That," she said softly, "is why you will wear the robe tomorrow." Thomas yanked his arm back, stumbling in his chair. "I didn't agree to this." "I didn't. You agreed when you signed," Branna said, her voice calm, unyielding. "The robe completes the binding. Without it, the mark will spread, and when it reaches your heart," she let the sentence hang, unfinished, the implication settling into the air like a shadow. Thomas's mouth had gone dry. "You're threatening me." Branna's gaze didn't waver. "No, I'm telling you the truth." The two pale-haired women by the hearth stirred for the first time, exchanging a glance. One of them spoke in a language Thomas didn't recognize, low, melodic, and edged with something sharp. Branna responded in the same tongue, her tone clipped, decisive. Whatever was decided, the women nodded, then slipped from the room without a backward glance. Thomas's mind raced. The urge to run was pounding through him, but his legs felt heavy, sluggish. He realized with a cold jolt that it wasn't just fear. The warmth from Branna's touch was still there, curling in his chest like an ember that refused to go out. The pale-haired man stepped back to the wall, his presence no less imposing for the distance. Branna sat again, folding her hands on the table. "You will stay in the east room tonight. The door locks from the outside. In the morning, we will prepare you." "Prepare me for what?" Thomas asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she rose again and gathered the robe into her arms. She carried it as one might carry an infant, cradled carefully, as though it were both precious and dangerous. Without another word, she crossed to the side door and disappeared, the garment's trailing edge whispering against the floor. The pale-haired man gestured toward the opposite doorway. "Come." Thomas didn't move. "If I say no, The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, a flicker, cold and certain. "Then we carry you." Thomas's pulse pounded in his ears. Slowly, he stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He followed the man through a narrow hall, lit only by a single oil lamp. The air here was cooler, smelling faintly of cedar, and something metallic. They stopped at a door near the end of the corridor. The man opened it to reveal a small room, a bed with a heavy quilt, a wooden chest, and a single narrow window with shutters closed tight. The only light came from the hall. "In the morning," the man said, "you will be called." The door closed, and the click of the lock was louder than it should have been. Thomas sat heavily on the bed. He stared at the closed shutters, then down at his arm, where the faint mark still glimmered. No amount of rubbing made it fade. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. A door opened, then closed again. Low voices murmured in that strange language, and the wind outside rattled the shutters. Thomas lay back, fully clothed, his eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. Every instinct screamed that he had to get out, but with each breath, the ember in his chest seemed to grow warmer, and, though he would never admit it, part of him wanted to see what tomorrow would bring. The morning came not with sunlight, but with the dull, muted glow of a sky smothered by thick, low clouds. A faint mist hung in the air, clinging to the wooden shutters of Thomas's room and softening the edges of the sound outside. It was not the sound of bustling town life he had hoped for. No merchants calling, no carts rattling over cobblestones, but something quieter, more deliberate. The first thing Thomas noticed when he opened his eyes was that he had not moved much at all in the night. It was as though his body had been pinned in place by a weight he could not see. The second thing he noticed was the smell, not the faint cedar from before, but something richer and heavier, like burning herbs and damp earth. He pushed himself upright, the quilt sliding to the floor, and instinctively glanced at his arm. The mark was darker now, the lines more pronounced. They shimmered faintly, even in the dim light, twisting in ways that made his head ache if he looked at them too long. The lock clicked. The pale-haired man stepped into the doorway. Without knocking, his presence filled the small room, though he said nothing at first. His eyes flicked once to the mark on Thomas's arm, then back to his face. "It's time," he said simply. "For what?" Thomas asked, his voice low and rough from sleep. "You'll see." There was no malice in the man's tone. If anything, there was an unnerving calmness, like a surgeon telling a patient that the procedure was ready. Thomas hesitated. I don't walk," the man interrupted, his voice still level, but edged now with something immovable. Thomas's throat tightened. He stood slowly, every muscle taut, and followed the man out into the hall. The house seemed different this morning, emptier, but not in a comforting way. The air felt denser, as if the walls were holding their breath. They passed the main room where the fire from last night still smoldered in the hearth. Branna was there, waiting. She was already dressed in a long garment, the color of deep forest moss, its fabric shimmering subtly as she moved. Her hair, loosed the night before, was now braided in an intricate pattern that looped around the crown of her head. The robe from last night was gone from sight, but Thomas had no doubt it was somewhere close. She didn't greet him. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, her eyes tracing the lines of the mark on his arm, which was visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "It's ready," she said to the pale-haired man, who gave a single nod and stepped away, vanishing through a side door. Branna turned to Thomas. "Come." Her voice was quieter now, but it carried the same inevitability as the lock clicking shut. Thomas followed her through another corridor, this one narrower, until they reached a door at the far end. When Branna pushed it open, a wave of warmth and scent rolled over him, the same herbal earthen smell he had noticed earlier. Now stronger. The room beyond was circular, lit entirely by candles arranged in tall iron holders that stood like sentinels around the edges. In the center of the floor was a symbol painted in thick dark strokes, a perfect mirror of the one on Thomas's arm, only far larger. Four of the pale-haired figures, 2 women, 2 men, stood at equal points around the circle. Each held a shallow bronze bowl from which smoke curled upward in thin, twisting streams. Their eyes were on Thomas, but none of them spoke. Branna stepped into the circle first, her bare feet silent against the worn wooden floor. She turned, waiting for him. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. "What is this?" "This," Branna said, "is where you take your place." "I didn't agree to." "You already did," she interrupted, her tone the same as last night. "The moment you signed, the moment you spoke the words, the binding began. The robe completes it. Without it, the mark will consume you." He shook his head. "You're lying. This is some game you people play with outsiders. Step into the circle," Branna said again, not raising her voice, but the air between them seemed to thicken. Pressing on his chest, Thomas looked toward the door. The pale man from before now stood there, blocking the exit. His expression had not changed, but his stance left no room for misunderstanding. Thomas wasn't leaving that way. Slowly, reluctantly, Thomas stepped forward. His foot crossed the painted line. The temperature seemed to change instantly, not warmer or colder, but sharper, as if the air itself was humming. The smoke from the bowls coiled toward him, drawn as if by an unseen current. Brana reached into a chest that sat beside one of the candle stands and drew out the robe. The deep red fabric seemed almost alive in her hands, catching the candlelight. In strange, shifting ways, she held it out to him. Put it on. Thomas didn't move. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a kind of weary certainty, as though she had seen this resistance before and knew exactly how it would end. She took a single step forward, the robe between them. If you refuse, she said softly, the mark will not wait for your consent. It will finish what it has begun. And when it does, you will not be yourself anymore. The four figures around the circle began to speak then, their voices low, weaving together into that same strange language he had heard last night. The sound was hypnotic, pulling at the edges of his thoughts, making it harder to remember why he had been resisting in the first place. His chest felt warm again, the same sinking, heavy warmth from before, only stronger now. Without quite realizing it, he reached out and took the robe. The fabric was heavier than it looked, and warm, too warm, as though it had been resting near a fire. When he slipped his arms into the sleeves, a wave of sensation rippled over him. The mark on his arm flared with light, then settled, its lines now perfectly matched to the symbol beneath his feet. Brana's gaze softened slightly, though her voice remained steady. Now it begins. The chanting grew louder, the smoke thicker. Thomas swayed where he stood, the warmth in his chest blooming outward, filling every inch of him. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and confusion, something else stirred. Something that did not feel entirely like his own thoughts,